welcome here for today. Rare and precious, ladies and gentlemen, are the books that manage to describe the world as we had not consciously seen it before. But outright exceptional are those books that manage to predict the dominant condition of not just the years, but the decades to come. Now, The Culture of Fear is such a book, and we are now 20 years after it was first published, and I was reading it last week, just as my guests were today. And it has nothing lost of its power, of its freshness, of its analytical power. Replace the word criminality that was en vogue in the 90s by immigrants or by Muslims, and you get a thorough description of the politics of fear that are so pervasive, so dominating in our current democracies. We have the honor and the pleasure to have Professor Emeritus Frank Furedi here with us on stage tonight, or this afternoon. He's been publishing extensively in the past few years on paranoia, on terror, on authority, on moral crusade and mistrust. And he's been speaking on this festival on his latest book on the power of reading, but we will talk today exclusively about fear. There's enough to talk about fear. And we will do so with an expert panel here of philosophers, of public intellectuals, 3 public intellectuals here on stage. Let me shortly present them to you. You have Tinneke Beeckman. She is a columnist with the Standard newspaper, and she writes about enlightenment. Her last book was about this wonderful combination of postmodernism, or an exercise in the quest for postmodernism, truth, power, and terror. Lieven, the cauter, well known with more than a dozen books in his library, his own books. He's a cultural philosopher, but he's also a prolific activist. And François de Smet, he's director of the Federal Migration Institute. He's a writer, he's an essayist, and the titles that you might know from him that are Reductio ad Hitlerum and La Marche des Ombres, a little but touching book on the effects of migration. All right, with this panel, we have 55 minutes on a topic that we could talk 2 or 3 hours about, because it's so pervasive in our contemporary culture. Let me start 10 minutes with Professor Furedi. Your book, first published in 1997, undoubtedly, I presume you would agree that the condition that you described then is far more thorough now. We live in a culture of fear now that is far more pervasive, far more extended than you could have imagined then?
I think it's changed dramatically. I'm not even sure whether we have the language to explain the changes, because a lot of the things that I find very interesting are what I call the performance of fear, which is different than really fearing, in that the culture of fear has become so absorbed that people in everyday language talk about the culture of fear and often use a language and forms of behavior where they are signaling that, I'm fearing something. It's a bit like in the old days, Christians were called God-fearing men, and they would say, I fear God. And that was like a good sign that you were, on the right side of the world. And today we're doing very similar things. We're saying, I fear this, I'm scared about this. And this performance of fear, which, you get in everyday language. For example, in America, you use when people say goodbye now, they don't say goodbye, they say stay safe, which I think is a wonderful expression. Stay safe, as if going to the drugstore or going to the butcher is going to be a big problem. So I think that has changed. To me, the most dramatic development has actually been in politics, where in 1997 you could still find left-wing people talk left-wing politics content, and right-wing people talk right-wing politics content-wise. Whereas now what you have is a kind of a language that's totally devoid of philosophical substantive matters, but is entirely a debate about what you should be more scared about. And in Europe, you have a situation where, for example, some of the parties are talking about fear. You have to fear immigrants, you have to fear Muslims, you have to fear sort of the borders going, and it's like a non-stop, relentless. But the interesting thing is that the people that recognize that the so-called populist or fear-mongering are totally unaware of the fact that they're doing the same thing. So, for example, if you go to Germany, you go to England, when people talk about populist, almost the next sentence is, it's just like the 1930s. Have you ever heard that? They're just like Hitler. And it's almost like you imagine that crystal meth is like coming next week. Because the same fear narrative is used on both sides without even thinking. And I never imagined that politically it would sink so low in Western societies. I think that's one of the things that shocked me.
There's one thing that we are less afraid of, and that is criminality. It's hard to imagine living in the 90s that 20 years later we would be not so much, have such fear of criminality as we had in those days. What happened? Do we have less criminality, or is it substituted by other fears?
Well, it's interesting you raise that. It's a huge debate in criminology as to why the fear of crime has migrated. I think what has happened in many societies is that the interpretation of crime, the narrative of crime has shifted. It used to be, somebody hitting you on the head and burglaring your house or stealing things from you. Whereas in the 21st century, the crimes we talk about are crimes of intimacy. They're about rape, they're about child abuse, they're about domestic violence. And we don't use the same language for those kind of acts as we did for the other ones. And I think that has changed our perceptions and the things that we fear. We're much more scared of people close to us than to the stranger in a dark alley.
Fear is caused by a lack of trust, you wrote in 1997. A lack of trust leads to more fear. Is that a circle with no end to it?
Well, that has changed. That has qualitatively changed because in 1997 there used to be much more conversation between people that were different. There was a greater capacity to give meaning to the community life. Whereas today what I find most troubling is the segregation and segmentation of social experience, where people watch the television that's different that other people watch. White people in America don't watch black television, black people watch black television, gay people watch gay programs, and you could just, there's about dozens of different segments in society. And what I find very interesting is that the day after Brexit, when I went into the university, and people were saying, Frank, I've never met a single person who voted for Brexit. And I said, well, that's your problem, that, all this time you only talk to people like yourself. And I think that kind of lack of dialogue and lack of meaning, I think, has really become much more pervasive.
At the same time, there's this element of unpredictability. If social norms, behavior become unpredictable, then that can lead to fear because it's always a risk. You always take a risk and it's always an adventure. If we withdraw in separate communities all together, well, each on our own, then you would think that you have more predictability.
We have more predictability, but on a narrower range of experiences. And I think that the expression in English we call things you can take for granted. When you can take things for granted, then you feel much safer than when you don't know. And I think that you're right, that you kind of go into your communities or your lifestyle groups. But the trouble is, once you do that, it's a very unstable existence. It's too limiting, and I think that's one of the reasons why people who are withdrawing into their communities then become so sensitive to everything that they hear that they lash out, and it's almost like they create, new problems as a result of that. And outrage, I don't know what the Flemish or the French word for outrage is, but that's the key way in which people react and engage with the insecurities they experience, rather than conscious, rational reasoning.
And they do so more and more on social media. It's completely different from what it was in 1997. You write about media. Media now, we can talk about it later. Media now have thoroughly changed. Everyone is becoming a medium in his or herself. how does that affect the culture of fear?
Well, I think that obviously it amplifies and intensifies it because, it's also pervasive. I think that the important thing is not to fetishize the media as a technology, but the fact that the media as a cultural institution has now become everything. So that public spaces, public life, debates offline are less significant now. So there's the balance between the media and the rest of society has shifted to the point at which everything is mediated through. So you often find young people with signs where they take a selfie, put it online, and they're making a statement. You go. I don't know if you've been to demonstrations recently. I went to a couple of demonstrations just to keep in touch. And when you go on a demonstration in London, everybody's taking selfies of themselves. It's like, and what they're then doing is they're putting the pictures online. So the demonstration is not to smash capitalism or to smash the system or to do this. The demonstration is to make a statement online. So that's more important.
And how does that relate to fear?
Well, I think what that then does is it creates a more intense form of segregation than before, so that what you have is a kind of reinforcement of prejudice. Everybody's prejudice gets reinforced because you only communicate on the social media with people who you know already are going to agree with you. And therefore you have this ghettos, hundreds of ghettos of non-communication. And you find that in universities where well, young people don't go to meetings anymore in the same kind of way, or they go to certain meetings, but it's kind of protected from other people coming. So we have an expression in England called safe space. I know you don't have it in Belgium yet, but a safe space means that in this space there are people like me, and you cannot criticize. There's no freedom of speech. I cannot go there and say you're an idiot or you're wrong. That's a safe space. And the very fact that you create these sanctuaries, that where you're quarantined from other people's ideas, I think it does speak to this insecurity in a very fundamental way.
What's the impact of terrorism on this culture of fear?
Far less than you imagine. One of the things I've been studying is the impact of terrorism. And it is interesting that the day after a bomb goes off, people are really scared, and maybe a week after, and when they see a soldier, they're reminded of it. But I think at the end of the day, people's insecurities are very diffuse. They're very arbitrary. They kind of shift from one thing to the next. And it's interesting because terrorism is the only fear that governments are more worried about than people. Usually it's the other way around. Usually people worry about things the governments don't worry about. But when you talk to counter-terrorism officials, they make the point, why aren't they more scared? They can't understand. And of course, there are good reasons for it, because the world we live in, there are so many other things that are preoccupying our brains. Having said that, obviously, last year it has become much more of a factor. The randomness of terrorism has become a really important factor. But the place where I've seen terrorism having the biggest impact has not been in Western Europe, but in Russia. You go to Russia, where, relatively big incident recently, when people see somebody with a hijab, for example, walking on the street, they call on the other side. They still remember that school that was, where young children were killed, and still so fresh in their minds that it's quite unusual that.
Now, last week after the attack in London, there was an interesting debate on the BBC where Simon Jenkins told in BBC Newsnight, said that BBC had far too much attention for terrorism, that it spent maybe 2 days in continuous loop on the terror attacks in London. And that was helping, first of all, to create a reign of fear and promoting terrorism and being on the side of IS. And so that kind of media attention, that kind of focus on terrorism would help to install a politics of fear and of defense. He said, well, remember the time when we had IRA attacks here in London? We treated them as criminal facts, and that was that was not a broad debate. It was definite. Do you feel that difference that we have spent far too much attention?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to what he said, but I think what he doesn't quite grasp is that you cannot do in the 21st century what the British government did with the IRA, because when you had the IRA bombings, there was no social media, there were no YouTube, and there was no 24-hour television. So therefore, containing these kinds of information was much, much easier. Today it's impossible. You couldn't really do that. Having said that, I think he's absolutely right. It's a tragedy that for 3 days, the BBC and ITV in England did nothing but go on about this. A single individual killing 4 people becomes so overwhelmingly a news item that you forget about the fact that we need a reality check. We need to take a bit of a distance. And I think that it's a tragedy that nobody gave a real lead. I think you need journalists who are very bold and say, well, let's talk about something else. That's the way you deal with it. You don't censor. You say, let's talk about something that is really important to our hearts.
Tinneke, you wrote about truth and the quest for truth after the attacks in France. To change subject, you need an audience that wants to hear a different subject. To have a path towards the truth, you need a way and an audience and a method to reach that truth and a willingness to want to reach that truth. Have you seen it all, having read the book as well? How does that relate, this diffusion of truth, insecurity and fear? How does that relate?
I think one of the key things is the relation between fear and distrust. And I think, are you fearful because you are distrustful, or do you become more distrustful because you are fearful? And I think that one also becomes, once you are distrustful, it's very difficult not to be fearful. And so what I've seen as a kind of decline of a method to be truthful and a kind of method to think critically and to have a kind of confidence about critical thought, I think it leads to distrust, and then it becomes very difficult not to be fearful or not to be talked into a kind of fear, because then everything becomes frightening. And I think one of the changes is that politicians, and one of the examples, I'm sorry we're going to have to mention him, but it's a bit unavoidable because I think he's a kind of worst case scenario of a more general problem, somebody like Trump. He uses the distrust of people as a kind of method to get elected, as an argument to get elected. Like, don't trust the media, don't trust, etc. And so that is because people are fearful, but also because there is more generally no real method. I think one of the elements is, and that's the thing I talk about in my book, to use a kind of critical method. And it touches upon, and I hope I'm not too vague, but it touches upon a few things that have already been said, like the fact that these safe spaces, the incapacity to be open to thoughts that are not your own thoughts, the tendency to look at other people and judge them for who they are and not simply say, I disagree with you in terms of content. No, what happens these days is that people reject the other as a human being. That every kind of political divide has become a moral divide, both from the left-wing side and on the right-wing side. And I think it has to do with that too, because critical thought for me, and that is fear eliminating, is in the very first place to be self-critical, and to be aware of your own prejudices, and to be aware of your own the way your own mind tends to overgeneralize or tends to react emotionally, and that for me is also part of that tradition of the Enlightenment. You have many thinkers and who connected that to politics also. Like in Thomas Jefferson, he really, when he describes a political system and he describes the quest for truth, they're obviously connected for him. I don't know if that...
You point towards postmodernism, you could also point towards education. Certainly in the American context, people are not educated enough anymore to have some kind of critical thought.
Yes, that's definitely, that's an issue that has been going on for a very long time. And also I think it's the kind of ignorance that makes people distrustful also, because you don't know what's going on, something must be going on. And then the sense that since you don't know really what it is, that you can easily feel that kind of secret hidden powers are at work. And it's one of the reasons why conspiracy theories are so generally around, and I think it totally undermines it, because you really have to have the feeling that you can add to the existing knowledge, and there has to be a trust that the other citizens do the same. You find it also with de Tocqueville, who says there is no philosopher so great that he doesn't use knowledge developed by others 1,000 times, and that he uses truths he hasn't researched himself. But there has to be a trust that you add to the existing knowledge without being de mauvaise foi, you know. And if that's not the case, then I think it's very difficult to have a democratic debate and to have an idea of a common citizenship.
Did you see the democratic debate deteriorate?
Well, there is a debate at the moment. It's very, very feeble and very, very weak. I was watching, I spent a bit of time, I was in Washington and listened to some of these discussions. And the thing that totally surprised me was how horrible both sides were. I mean, because, we don't have to talk about Trump, we all know what it's like, but when you have the Clinton campaign being so ineffective.
Is that to do with general, what you described in the book, as I'm going to just give a summary. Weak institutions, diminishing, that was 1997. Weak institutions, diminishing interest in politics, crumbling authority, diminishing self-confidence, societal atomization, the breakdowns of the structures of society. All that has been happening since 1997. Would you say it's only got worse?
Well, I think there's a qualitative change. You know, when you have the two big parties in America unraveling, because that's what happened. The Democratic Party is just really become empty. The Republican Party is just all over the place. France, the Socialist Party, I mean, what's happened to the Socialist Party? You know, it used to be like that was France, you know, and what's happened to the other parties? So you can see the institutions are, it's not just...
Do you see signs of hope, Macron or others, or new movements we might come to?
Well, Macron is a French Trump, but educated, and you know, I mean, in the sense that he's playing on the outsider card.
You would certainly not agree.
I know, but I mean, even though he's not an outsider, neither is Trump, but he's kind of playing that kind of card that I'm not like the parties and everything. So it's what we used to call an anti-politics politician, except in the 21st century. I think there is always hope, but it's not going to be in the mainstream parties, which I think are zombie parties now. We're seeing there's a demand for new parties everywhere. I think in England, what's wonderful for me is that when I talk to young people, and they always tell me, we need a new party. They don't know what that party would be, but they recognize that there is something new that needs to be built and created. And that's a positive beginning.
Before we go into activism, I would first like to dive into migration. François, how did migration become such a fear? I know it's a general question, but it's one I'm still wondering about. How did we get this far that we're all convinced that we're swamped by migrants, even though the numbers have been high in recent years, but now the figures are quite stable, on the level of what they were in 2007, 2009?
Well, thank you for this 2 hours question. Well, I would say fear of migration is both rational and irrational. That's all the point. It's irrational because, as you mentioned it, when you see the last big migration crisis in 2015, actually you have perhaps 2 or 3 asylum seekers for 1,000 European citizens. This is really nothing. We can manage it. The problem in migration is that European countries do not share the burden on a fair basis, but mostly we are the most we are rich. We could be much more generous, but I think that what migration fear shows us now, this is a global fear of how can I say that, dilution of identity. And I think we already touched it in this discussion. I think that people are afraid to consider that what they are, what are the ideological base, or the nationality, the skin color, etc., can change and can be, altered by new people coming. And the point is, it is non-rational because it's not 2 or 3 people on 1,000 that can drastically change who we are. But what is rational about this is that it's true that in a long time of humankind history, all is made of change. The white skin color, for instance, does exist only since 8,000 years. I think that's very interesting to recall at the time when other people want to make race again, black, white, etc. Our religions, our nations, all of these things are very temporary. This is going to disappear. We talk about France. Well, France is carrying the name of people who did invade France, les Francs, and their religion, the Catholic religion, is an importation from Middle East. Well, and you have French people who can define strongly their identity, like there is something eternal. Well, I spoke about France, but you can do that with every country, every culture, every language in the world. So that's the point. We have a very short. Unfortunately, we live a very short period of time, and we arrive in the middle of a very long scale history, and it's very hard to realize how fragile our identities are. And I think that the migrants are a kind of inconscient recalling of that. They recall us our own fragility. And they recall another thing, is that nobody have chosen the place where we were born. And, well, as people who are on the good side of the barrier when the grass is green, etc., we can consider the other one who is coming like somebody who has not the right to be here, but actually we no right to be there as well as the one who were born in a poor side. And so the guy who doesn't accept this fact, who is coming to take something that we already have, is recalling us that there is no merit about this. And so all of this, for me, is fear of identity, delusion of identity.
I'm going to ask you one other two-hour question. How to deal with that fear? Because as you describe it now, there's no solution to it. It's a deep cultural fear. It's like a fear of identity. It's a fear of it's an existential fear, and people are right in their suspicion that something is going on.
Well, there is something that we can invest on. Of course, I'm very fatalistic, but as you mentioned, perhaps more fight against ignorance, more philosophy, more learning about other religions and culture, sending more people and young people.
Is it a question of knowledge?
Well, I think so, in partly, because
is fear ever a question of knowledge? Sorry to interrupt you. Is fear ever a question of knowledge?
No, very rarely, because I think often very intelligent people are more fearful than...
Why is that?
Well, because it's an existential question of insecurity. I think it's your place in the world. And your place in the world is not something that you can put into words and knowledge. It's something you feel.
And can you then dismantle fear by
you can,
injecting more philosophy?
No. What you can do in the migration thing is you can change our policies. I think that unless we change multiculturalism and go back to it or adopt an assimilationist strategy that recognizes that there's got to be a common good, common virtues, common way of life that everybody needs to sign up to. These fears will always exist. I think we're very cowardly and very scared to say that what's the way of life? What does it mean to be Belgian, or what does it mean to be living in Ghent? And we have to make decisions about what is the life that we want people to sign up to. And at the moment, we're pretending that that's not a problem. Diversity is good. I don't know what's good about diversity.
You were talking in 1997 about common values and norms and how important that was. Even reading the book with a progressive agenda, it must have been quite hard, because this book talks already in 1997 how fear grows out of the lack of norms and values. One way to get back. Do you hear me? One way to reinstall security is by adopting common norms and values. That's exactly the kind of reactionary agenda sweeping all over Europe.
Well, yes.
Why is that reactionary? I don't understand. That's what progressives have argued with the Enlightenment. That's what the Enlightenment was about. I mean, that's what the Enlightenment was about, common values. Enlightenment didn't say, you have your values, we have our values, you know, you go your way, my way. It was an attempt to create a humanist impulse of coming together. So, I mean, reactionaries are not like that, in my book.
Yes, well, of course, yes. But just to sort of start and be clear, I think what we live, and also to sort of enter the conversation, I think what we live is a paradox of fear. And you could refer to Freud, as in fact François does a bit, irrational and rational. Freud makes a difference between neurotic and real fear. And Mr. Furedi has a tendency to do as if any fear is neurotic, fictitious. Yeah? So the paradox of fear of today is that we don't fear enough things that are really coming to us, like something not mentioned so far, which I find very strange, namely climate change. And combined with migration and demography, because the demography is also one of these themes that we tend to sort of avoid. So the paradox of fear is that we fear some things that are maybe not as dangerous, like our others, the whole crimes of intimacy, or migrants, or terrorism, and we don't fear enough the things that maybe are life-threatening to humans and non-humans alike, like climate change. For me, that is the paradox, and that is real. Second, I think the reasons of fear are also real. Globalization is changing the world in a way that we feel insecure. The state cannot handle it anymore. The state is retreating, as you can see in the work of Bauman, who instead of focusing on the fear as such, as a neurotic, fictitious fear, goes for the reasons of fear. And there are good reasons to be fearful. Third, there is a real politics of fear. And the politics of fear is not like in the book, it's not the consumer and activist guys of like the book ends, the book Culture of Fear ends with a sort of attack on activism. I think that is not politics of fear, especially not today. Politics of fear is the army in the street. That is politics of fear. No? That's the most concrete politics of fear. And I do think that if we say politics of fear, we should point to the real politics of fear. And of course, populism, rightist populism, works on this fear. As for the book, I have many criticisms. But I think the main thing is, for me, it's an eye-opener, the book, so I agree, I enjoyed reading it. But then suddenly, and what I think is the most, how would I say, captivating aspect of the book is the criticism of language. I will never forget that. The fact that we speak about security, safety, being at risk. Of course, it's very Anglo-Saxon also. Being safe, toxic, which for me was a new one. Toxic parenting, toxic relationship, toxic. That was a very interesting one. So for me, the strong point of the book is its critique, as you could say, of a certain language. The weak point.
Can we go to norms and values? The thing that underlies a lot of fear is the lack of common norms and values.
Yes. Well,
how
yes.
from an activist agenda?
Yes. No.
How could you promote norms and values that are common and that could be constructive against fear?
Yes. Well, I think people should just I mean, I call this, and it's also a sort of reply to François. I think what I call exercise in globalization can help us. My children woke up in a world in the crash, in the kindergarten, even lower than kindergarten, as babies, 6 months old. They woke up and they saw children that were black, brown, yellow. Yeah? For them, racism and this sort of cultural fears that we're just talking about are inexistent. They find it incomprehensible. Why? Because their almost primordial experience was diversity. And I think diversity is very good. I do not want to go back to the Flemish kitchen. I'm sorry, I adore the Flemish kitchen, but we have been enriching our culture so much, and I think the kitchen is a good example of that. So
norms and values should not necessarily be returned to the Flemish kitchen.
Yes, but the common will be, I find a common ground with my Moroccan baker and my Pakistani...
How do you turn it into a political program? How do you turn that into politics?
Well, in politics, I think, for instance, the fact that I feel an agreement growing in my own neighborhood of that plastic bags, it's a small one, are bad. That is a progress. That when we hear about storms, that even it's not only the high educated people who now consider ecology an important topic, that is spreading. And then, of course, if you ask activism, I think, for instance, to be concrete, urban farming, like in Park Farm here in Brussels and many places around the world, what you do is you work towards urban ecology, and at the same time you mix cultures. Because it is true...
In a practice.
So it is true that the risk is that we all live in our bubble. And in the end we will all be living in gay communities. And I am fearful of that. In 2004 already I was warning for this capsule civilization and the bubbles. And I do think we can break that open, and a city like Brussels proves that this happens all the time. You go to the beurs and you meet all the time people from all sorts of cultures. But of course, to really meet them, you need an activity, and all these activities like urban farming, urban activism, do it in a very concrete way. So I'm positive, just do not stay in Braschaat, come to Brussels.
Tinneke, how do you read norms and values? How do you, because that is, if you see one way out of one way of engaging in political activity will have to be in the construction of something that we share.
Yes, and I think that what Lieven said, I agree with the fact that you do need common activities, etc. in your neighborhood, and it can be very emancipatory in many ways, and you learn a lot, etc. But I think there's a lot of confusion in what you say when you say your children grow up and they see people of all color. Of course, that's a good diversity, a real diversity. You don't want to go back to the 1950s. I'm a woman. I definitely don't want to go back to the Flanders of the 1950s. It's not about color. I don't want to go back to a kind of homogeneous white kind of color. I don't think anybody wants that. But what you do need in a politicized sense is to have agreement about a framework, and there, for me, the norms and the values, they do come in. There are things that I do not want to renegotiate, for instance, equality between men and women, or also the fact that there is such a thing as free speech, and that when we disagree, we use language, we don't become violent, even if you are emotional, or even if you think you have good reasons to be offended. Well, the freedom of speech is not just about being able to say what you want, but it's also accepting that people say things that maybe to you are offensive and things like that. That all belongs to a kind of framework that citizens share, and that is also the basis of a political community. And then you can have many discussions about left-wing, right-wing, the importance of ecology.
Are these values being threatened? Should we be fearful of the threat to our values?
But I think I don't personally feel very threatened. I don't see it as a kind of threat, but I also think
political discourse.
Yes, it does have. I think it does make a difference then where you live. I think in Braschaat I would not be fearful, but I've also lived in other areas, and then it's not so self-evident, for instance, that there's a public sphere and that as a woman you can walk around freely. I'm sorry to say, but it's not generally so that everybody agrees that women can do that. So I can imagine people
So we should defend it. Talking norms and values is from a point of view of defensiveness.
But I think we should realize that it's the basis for plurality and for having a society that is free and where we can all fight for what we think is a kind of common good. So to me it's a condition, and then there's a lot of diversity and different culture and also different political views are also possible. So I don't see it as something reductive. I see it as the condition for a kind of plurality. But of course, what I just mentioned, the equality of men and women, it's not just, I think everybody should be. And I think a lot of the things I talk about, the Enlightenment, are instructive for everybody, also people who have been living in our country for many generations. It's instructive for every citizen, so in that sense, it's something that we should all share. But we do have to share something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree broadly. I think that we must live in a parallel universe, because the Europe that I travel in is nothing like the Europe that you describe. I mean, yes, young people mix together. It's nice to go to London and see black and white kids going to clubs and, in schools, friendship groups and everything else. But if you go to Paris, for example, in the 21st century, I remember what Paris was like. And the degree of, it reminds me of the American South in the old days in terms of segregation, segmentation. If you go to large parts of Germany and even Belgium, I mean, to be really honest, I remember the first time I came to Belgium, it's nothing like the way that it was in terms of levels of suspicion and tension, fragmentation. I think you have to live in the real world, and I think in the real world, you have a situation where many of the younger generations that are now growing up are really, sort of moving away from each other in a way that is very disturbing. Yes, there are universities and things like that, but you go to some places, and one of the things I do is when I go to university, I always look at how people mix. Do they have black tables? Like in America, all the blacks sit at a table and all the whites sit at another table. Is there anything like that? And I think we're getting a lot of that now, even in Belgian universities, where people sit, slightly separately from one another. I think, I wish you were right, but I think you're fantasizing because you're not prepared to address the fact that there is no common dialogue taking place in Belgium or in Europe, where people are actually discussing many of these kind of fundamental issues. And I think that, activism is great. I don't know why you think I'm not into activism. I've led strikes, I organized parties, I've organized demonstrations. I've always been an activist. But the activism has got to have some kind of political content to it, and especially in the 21st century, some philosophical ideals that we're trying to kind of strive towards. I just one little thing.
Yeah, let me come back to the norms and values, because you talk about them in your book in 1997, what it means to be British or to be English. Now, it becomes a completely different question nowadays. What it means to be French is now the subject of a heated debate of the French national campaign. So the idea of norms and values is captured entirely by the right wing and by populist politics.
But that's the tragedy, because we've allowed a situation where people like that are connecting with people's cultural insecurities. The fact that, at the end of the day, most people in Europe have a desire to belong in a kind of stable sense. And the right, in many places, keys in on that. And the left talks about globalization, like you did, globalization, the world is changing very fast. Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, almost 100 years ago, the world was changing even faster. And have you ever heard every European document, every political document begins with the same sentence? We live in an ever-changing world. Have you ever heard that? The world is changing faster than ever before.
It's called modernity, of course.
Sorry?
I mean, modernity is this fury of disappearance.
But it's always been like that.
This is true also.
Yeah, but it is true, but the trouble is that the change then becomes an excuse.
I mean, globalization is something you can really define. Yeah, I mean, we only have an hour.
Reality, as it now is. You see, the point is that, yes, there is change, always been change, but that doesn't excuse us from coming down to earth and saying that are there some everyday quotidian values that we can discuss and debate.
François, what's the reality of the Belgian society as you experience it? I mean, in terms of this segregation and the need for norms and values. I'm just looking for a way out. Maybe my norms and values story, and we will come to you, is the wrong one, but it's the essential one in all dialogues of fear.
I could say that I'm listening to them and I feel that they can both be right. I mean, in Brussels, you have, for me, I'm from this city, you have three Brussels. You have the white, good educated Brussels. You have all the neighborhoods from foreign origins, and that's true. There is a problem of integration in all parts of the city. And you have the Eurocrats. And that's, I'm fascinated. Here we have a kind of new project, I'm sorry, I don't know the word in English, le piétonnier, this range when you can walk, and which is
zone.
Sorry,
Car-free zone.
thank you. Which is a political project. Well, interesting, whatever you can think about. Which across totally all the center from the north to the south, and which creates a new space when these three parts of the cities do meet, are forced to meet, and of course it's not happening good every time, but that's I don't think that was the meaning of the project. The city wanted to get the cars off, etc. But it creates something new. So I think it's very naive. I don't know, but to find place physically when people are forced to meet, to meet each other, to exchange, to debate. When it can be, of course, safe. I don't see another way to make sure that people are less afraid from each other. It's very naive, and it's not on Belgium, because we can talk about the price between French-speaking, Flemish, etc. But in Brussels, we have very good that we can discuss.
Even on Dudley, you would agree.
There's too many things on the table here, but anyhow, I'll try to be very quick. For free speech, I think the waiver, trying to inscribe the state of exception into the constitution is much more dangerous for free speech than all the things that Tinneke is referring to. Much more dangerous. So if I fear free speech, I fight people who try to undermine.
I don't agree with what the waiver says. In nowhere did I say that it was a great idea. I think it's a terrible idea.
No, you leave. No, I didn't say that. I say that you leave out the waiver. You are fearful of the radicalized people. But I mean, I met, for instance, an Islam teacher yesterday, and he said, "My religion is Islam, but democracy is first." Simple like that, clear.
Yeah.
It's not just the radicalized. No? You also even people who are not connected to a religion. There is generally this sense of
trying to. Because if you say to shut up, I should shut up. You should shut up too. I respect that, but I mean, yes, I was questioned. Otherwise, I'll never get that. I tried to respond for quite a while. So, I think Brussels was a dying white city in the 80s. I was here. Yeah, it was half empty. So to go back to the good Brussels, I mean, there was no good Brussels itself. No, I mean, yes. So it's much richer. I mean, if you look at the people at Fries and Kat, the youngsters, they mix every night. They mix. It's not only white middle-class youngsters. So my daughters, they walk the city at all hours of the day and the night. So apparently it's not so dangerous to move around. So I mean, I think we have to give up this. I mean, I think the scare of scares is also a scare.
But what is the point of what you're saying? Is that
it's not that we don't have a city to live in. I mean, people who are used to Brussels love Brussels, and I go out and my dogs go out that is a moment. And the youngsters who fought for Fries and Kat, the square, they are there in the streets and they share the streets.
You're talking the language
so
that we were talking in 2000, Brussels 2000, I still remember it, cultural capital, that was that language. But we're 17 years later.
Yes.
Attacks, terrorism, fundamental radicalization later.
Yes. But terrorism is something we created. I mean, the whole thing on terrorism, but that's, of course, again...
That's a different debate.
Yes.
Would you say then the fear for these, and people are more fearful of many of these events? You don't believe it?
Well, I mean, if I say, my thesis is the paradox of fear. That's why I started with it. No? So, for some things we are far too fearful, and for some things, like climate change, we are not fearful enough, because we say, oh, yeah, and we take more planes every year, statistically speaking, which is a crime. It's criminal behavior, irresponsible behavior. I hope that people wake up one day and say, we have to fear climate change. So if we really fear it, like a roof that could, we do something about it. And no, in a new don't.
In a new book on fear, would you agree with that point of view, that we should fear and fear it as a way of engaging political activity and action against?
Well, not really. I think that the paradox of fear argument is a little bit simplistic in the sense that it could, obviously, fear is real. I never said fear wasn't real, I think the issue at stake is the perception of the threat. And what I'm really worried about is that what's being done there is, and this has happened for like 20 years, you're wrong to fear that strangers will rape you. You should fear about your husband raping you. So you kind of have what's called competitive fear. And similarly, people on the right say, you should fear immigrants. People on the green say, you should fear climate change. And I think in both cases, and the danger, of course, is that then you kind of raise the stakes because you want people not to go on airplanes, you want people to recycle and everything else, and you do create a slightly hysterical narrative in relation to climate change, which is a bit unnecessary. And I think that in that sense you have, fear appeals. There's a big literature on fear appeals about these kind of issues. And
does fear ever lead to action? Does fear ever lead to action?
Well, I mean, of course, what do we call fear? I mean, my slogan remains pessimism in theory, optimism in practice. I think that's the way to. I mean, my books are very dark. So it's not that I'm the optimist. I think nobody, as I can see, is so pessimistic in writing of all of us here around the table. Entropic Empire on the city of man in the age of disaster, Capture Civilization on the city in the age of fear are very clear in their titles, I think. So I'm not the naive optimist. On the contrary, but I think, on the other hand, that if we act and look around, for instance, if we look at the city of Brussels.
But to my question, does fear lead to action?
Well, I do think if I fear that my roof will fall on my head, I will do something.
In terms of climate change, for example, does it ever lead to action?
Of course, if people are aware, I mean, and you can see it happening now, that people are finding understanding that we should take less planes and that we should eat less meat. And your argument that there's no reason for fear is called climate skepticism.
No, I didn't say there's no reason for fear. I just said that
and it's very
fear is never the basis for good politics, whatever the issue.
But that's not.
Well, Hans Jonas invented, some philosopher invented something he called heuristics of fear, which is an attempt to rehabilitate fear. And I think that's something really in common with Frank Furedi, is that he was making the clear distinction between the global fear of ecological issues, environment, climate change, that we need to have a positive fear about, and the fact that this fear should be restrained to that. What Frank says in his book, if I have read it right, it's not that the fears about climate change does not have a reality, is that the fact that this fear has invaded all the sphere of human relations, and that we have a lack of association, of unions, of association of things that put people together. So I think there is a way to make you agree. Yes.
But does that come for the commons? But then for the commons,
but does that coming together, can it ever arise out of fear, or should we cast fear aside and make a leap into faith?
I think, and here I'm going to be the Spinozist, I think that fear, by definition, has something, I don't think it really engages people. So I don't think it's positive emotion in that sense. Neither is guilt, for instance, which is also very much involved, both with migration and with the question of ecology. And I don't think they are the right basis for political action. I think generosity and having also a kind of reasonable sense of things that you can do, feeling empowered, I think is much more important than feeling fearful.
How do we ever get there from the universe that you described, the language indeed, in which we use, the politics that we've put in place to turn it into our laws? How do we ever turn into a place where there's more confidence?
Well, I think we need a cultural revolution. I mean, many of the things that all of us agree on are really quite important. And I think to move forward, we need to almost have a renaissance. I mean, I know it sounds horrible, but we need a renaissance with the old humanist values of belief in rational agency of human beings. To do something is critical, and in particular, I think all of us can agree that one of the biggest scourges that we all face is this powerful mood of fatalism. that exist, that somehow we don't matter, that there are these forces beyond our control. That's why I'm really so much against globalism. We have to find a way of reconstituting human agency, which is the only way in which we'll have solidarity, because that's what we need to overcome segmentation, is genuine solidarity, where we actually understand that we have more in common if we stick together than if we go in our individual fragmented way.
Yes, but I mean, Podemos, Syriza, the very important wave of the globalism, the Porto Alegre, the World Social Forum, the Indignados, Occupy Wall Street, it's as if they don't exist. I mean, there are...
Where are they? Where is the Indignados? Where is the Occupy movement? Where is Porto Alegre?
Podemos, I mean, of course, the forces against them, I mean, Syriza has been killed by our politicians, that's for sure. But I mean, to say that, and of course these are waves and they are fragile, etc. But to look at the world as if there's no activism, no faith in change. I mean, there is. I mean, this is the new humanism. Come on. I mean,
no, I never said that, but all I'm saying is
I think your humanism is too technological, by the way.
Well,
discussing
you're the first person that ever accused me of being technological, because
your book is full of...
I wouldn't know what technology looks like if I bumped into it.
No, not too technophilic. Your book is very clear. I mean, you accuse in almost every page of distrust against science, very strongly. It's a strong element in your book, distrust against science.
Well, I mean, I love science.
Technology.
Yeah. I think, well, anyway, you're obviously able to interpret things according to your instincts, but to go back to, when you go back to these waves of activism, and they're good, except a lot of them are not really activism in the sense of creating solidarities. I look back upon these movements, and I ask myself, are there traces of that? Is there something in that young people today can take as a legacy, or has it just gone? I mean, Occupy movement is interesting. One day everywhere, next day now you see it, now you don't. Now that to me tells me that activism was bereft of intellectual content, bereft of ideas. And I think that instead of saying everything is nice, let's ask some hard questions of ourselves. I don't blame Occupy, I blame people like myself who should have been much more in the forefront.
Now, what should, to conclude, because we've come at the end of our hour, what should some of these ideas be that can be the basis for a movement or a way of thinking out of this monster of fear, or this closure of fear?
Well, the first one is we have to reject there is no alternative, Tina. I think there is always an alternative, because I think politics is very much about that. Secondly, we have to have a much more robust belief in progress. I mean, the Enlightenment idea of progress was really quite important. And thirdly, I think that we have to understand that we as human beings are responsible for our destiny, both individually and collectively. I'm always, I think it's almost like Jean-Paul Sartre's writings on existentialism have more relevance now in the 21st century than they had at that time, in terms of, if you're going to be radical, then we have to be radical in the sense of living with the consequences of our actions and spelling that out. I think those are, to me, the really important things.
Do you see that these ideas are somehow existent somewhere?
I think there's a demand for it. I think that at the moment, intellectually, we're struggling quite a bit, but I just think that really, that there is a kind of naive, if you want to call it, demand for more of a transformative way of approaching the world, and I think that that's too soon to say, but hope is really important. I know it sounds naive, but we have to live as optimists. We can't really give up on humanity at this particular critical stage in time.
And now we've come at the end of this session, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.